Hello everyone and welcome to this third video in my series of deck ideas for the Lord of the Rings Living card game, which is a card game by Fantasy Flight Games. The title of this video is Shhh, It's a Secret, and the theme of this video is Secrecy. So the idea of this video is for me to share with you my ideas for a Secrecy deck, just some thoughts also about this new Secrecy mechanism that's come into the game in this recent cycle. And something I started being fairly sceptical about. I like the cards, I like some of the Secrecy cards. Didn't really see how they could be made into a deck, but thought I'd give it a go anyway. And I was actually really surprised with the way the deck turned out, and actually how overpowered it can seem against, if it works, how overpowered it can seem against certain quests. So just for those of you who don't know, Secrecy is a fairly recent introduction. It came in this cycle, so it's the first Secrecy cards were seen in the Redhorn Gates, which is the first adventure pack for the Dwarven cycle. And the way Secrecy works, it's pretty cool. It's based on your threat, and it's a way that we can play cards at a lower cost than their printed cost. So if our threat is equal to 20 or less, so it can be equal to 20, then we're in what's called Secrecy mode. And then that triggers we can play cards for a slightly cheaper value. So looking at an example here, we've got a card called Out of Sight. Some nice artwork there. We've got the Hobbit hiding from what looks like the Nazgul on the horseback there. So again, sort of inspired by the films though, I think, a little bit. But the cost of this card usually is 5. So we're going to play this from hand, it would cost us 5. A bit insanely high, probably not a card you're going to get out very easily. But don't worry, because we have here an effect called Secrecy Free, which means that if we are in Secrecy mode, we can play this card for 3 less than its printed value, which then changes its value, becomes a lot more playable. We're more likely to have 2 spirit resources than 5, certainly not early on in the game, and certainly with 2 heroes, because with Secrecy decks, we're probably going to be running 2 heroes, unless you're insane and want to run 1. But this deck is running on 2 heroes, so it makes those cards suddenly much more playable. So I'm going to take you through the deck. As usual, this is 50 cards, so it's a tournament-sized deck. Not that there are any tournaments to enter at the moment, but I'm using 1 core set and every adventure pack up to and including the Long Dark. As I said, all the Secrecy cards are actually in this cycle. So if you're interested in building this deck, you're going to need to purchase pretty much the Redhorn Gate and all the expansions since that, so that the 4 there, since the Redhorn Gate. So let's look at our heroes first. So first up, now just before I start, I should say I'm not saying this is the perfect Secrecy deck, but to say it's a deck I found works reasonably well, and what I might do over the months is update this as new cards come out. So the adventure packs coming up, I might swap in some cards. I think we're hopefully going to see more Secrecy cards. There's some talk whether this is just going to exist in this cycle, whether it's going to actually be continued as a mechanism after this cycle. Hopefully it will be. It's a pretty cool aspect of the game, one that's probably one of my favourite decks to play here because it's just slightly different, and when it works, it's just insanely powerful. Okay, so the first hero I've gone here for is Gloin. Now he's 9 threat, the usual 2 questing, 2 attack, 1 defence, 4 hit points. The reason I've gone for Gloin here is, firstly, is we're going to see a lot of the very powerful Secrecy cards in this deck, and some non-Secrecy cards are leadership. So I just needed a leadership hero there. It was really a choice between Gloin or this guy, Fairdred. But I went for Gloin in the end for 2 reasons. Firstly, his questing power is slightly higher, it's at 2, which actually does seem to make a bit of a difference. Early on in this deck, you're going to be questing with your heroes probably more than allies, so you need just to have a little bit just to get you through the first couple of rounds, where there's perhaps a location, staging area, or a location or 2 if you're playing multiplayer, or if you're playing more people. So it works pretty well there from a quest perspective. Also, just on a very simple level, Fairdred is actually in my Rohan deck, which I'll show you guys in a later video. So just to save me swapping in and out all the time, I've just stuck with Gloin here, who works pretty well. So we've got Gloin going on this Secrecy adventure, and he's joined by Frodo. Now, Frodo's threat is 7, so we're looking at a total starting threat of 16. So that's hopefully going to give us 4 turns of Secrecy at least. There's some tricks we've got in the deck to keep that down a little bit. Now, the unusual thing about this deck, which is perhaps a little bit counterintuitive, we start off in Secrecy mode, but as you'll see, the way this deck works is we don't need to stay in Secrecy mode for the entire adventure. And in fact, by the time we come out of Secrecy mode, if everything's gone to plan, we should have so many resources that we can actually just play some of these Secrecy cards at their full cost. And this is one of the fun aspects of this deck. You just end up generating huge amounts of resources. And one thing that I was really surprised about with the Secrecy mechanic is that just how many resources you can generate. And there are certain cards that make that very easy to do. Another thing very useful about Frodo here is his ability. When he's damaged once per phase, again, important to remember it's once per phase, you can't just keep doing this multiple times throughout the phase. So you have to be careful how you block here, because you can only do it once. But he can put the damage into threat. Now, again, this might seem counterintuitive in the Secrecy deck, where we're trying to keep our threat low for as long as possible, which we are. But as I said, at some point, we're going to go past that barrier and we're not going to care. We're just going to go past the 20 threat and we're going to say, right, we're done with Secrecy mode now. So at that point, he becomes a very useful defender. I tend to find by that point with this deck, you do have other options for defending. You shouldn't have to use him too much, but he's just there if we need something to block a more powerful attack, or an attack that gets through. Sometimes, also in a lot of these adventures, what's pretty nasty recently, we see a lot of things that bypass allies. There's the, I think it's the Warg in Redhorn Gate, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but one where you can't use allies to block that attack, so it goes straight to a hero. It does 1 damage to that hero, I think, in addition to any other damage it does. So it's quite handy just to have a way to deal with that, and Frodo seems a very good way of dealing with that later on in our adventure. So there we go, Frodo and Gloin are going to sneak out and do a Secrecy mission. And the first card that's going to help them here is Resourceful. Now this is a brilliant card, very, very good card. It's a cost of 4 from hand. You're probably not going to want this in another deck. It's too expensive really to justify playing in a non-Secrecy deck. Just because by the time you've paid for resources, it's going to take another 3 or 4 rounds before you see any benefit really to make back what you've paid for it. So it's not really the best card to play from your hand in a non-Secrecy deck. But what we've got here, Secrecy free. So suddenly this card, which is cost 4, becomes a cost of 1. So suddenly we've got a very playable card and a ridiculously strong effect for just 1 resource. Also, it's not a sphere resource, it's a neutral resource. So we can actually use any sphere. We can use either Frodo or Gloin here to pay for it. And we just attach it to one of the heroes, and every round we generate 1 extra resource. Sounds very simple, incredibly powerful effect. Throughout the game, you're now effectively doubling up the resources that either Frodo or Gloin have got, so your heroes have got. Now you want to try and get this in your opening hand to make this deck work. If you don't get it, you might want to consider your mulligan to try and get the card. There are other options to get some resources, but if you get this card early on, you're pretty much set. You're going to have a really easy time, or an easier time, with getting this engine up and running. But this is part of that engine, that resource generation engine I mentioned. So very good card there. Another one that's going to help us is our old friend here, the Steward of Gondor. I'm not going to talk about this card for too long, because we've seen it in my last video, and most people are familiar with it. It's just a really good way of getting 2 extra resources per turn. And again, if we've got that and Resourceful, then we can start generating some serious resources. And pretty cheap anyway, 2 leadership resources there. Another card that's key to this deck, which I really like, is called A Good Meal. Now we can attach this to a Hobbit hero, which luckily Frodo is. We can attach it to Frodo. What it lets us do, we discard it, and then it reduces the cost of the next card we play by 2. Very, very useful in this deck. Our resources at the beginning are not very plentiful, so very handy to be able to reduce the number down by 2. Also note here, it doesn't say that there's a maximum minimum value. So if you have 2 of these in your hand and you attach both of them to Frodo, you can discard for a discount of 4. Obviously the minimum is going to be 0, but you can bring the cost of some of the spirit cards in this deck down to really, really playable level, and you can get away with some pretty crazy plays. As we'll see, some of these cards are relatively expensive, but they come a lot cheaper with cards like this in play. So that's really our free resource generating cards. If you can get those out early in the game, you're pretty much set. As I say, you want to make sure you've got at least 1 of those in your hand before you start. I would mulligan and perhaps do a sneaky another mulligan if you're not playing by the completely official rules. But the idea is to get those in your hand and out and play as soon as you can. On to our next card. It's a leadership card. It's a rather great cost of 0, always my favourite cost, and it's called Taking Initiative. Now this card, you discard the top card of your deck. If the discarded card print cost is equal or higher than the number of characters you control, you get to draw 2 cards and deal 2 damage to an enemy. Now again, this is a card for early on in this deck's life cycle, in its sort of span, its play span. You're going to be playing this early on when you've got a lower number of characters on the table. Remember, characters does include heroes, so Frodo and Gloin are going to count as 2. So you're going to want to have to draw a card that's worth 2 or more at the beginning to get an extra 2 cards. Works quite nicely. Early on, obviously, you can get that to work. You're going to get 2 cards. If there's an enemy in the staging area as part of your setup, you're then able to deal 2 damage before it gets a chance to get to you. It's a really good card and a nice bit of artwork there as well. Okay, and our next card, riding into view very quickly, coming from the left here. Nice piece of artwork again here, horseback rider there. Although the horse does look absolutely massive compared to the rider. The rider must be pretty tiny, or that's a really massive horse. But in any case, we're glad to see them because they're bringing for us Timely Aid. Probably the best card, the best Secrecy card that's been released so far. Definitely belongs in this deck and actually is the key really to the entire deck working. At a cost of 4, it would be pretty heavy to play from hand, but actually in this deck towards the end you'll find you can actually play it from hand if you find yourself in that situation. So the nice thing though, we've got a cost of Secrecy free, which means that we can actually play this for a very low cost of 1 leadership resource if we're in Secrecy mode. But what do we get to do? We get to reveal the top 5 cards of our deck, and we get to put 1 ally into play if able. And then we shuffle all the other revealed cards back into our deck. Insanely good card, very powerful card, and we're going to see why. If we load our deck with very good hit strong allies, so if we've got a nice number of strong allies in there that are going to help us, this card can really help. And if you get this early on, if you can play it turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, you can actually get some strong allies out there. As we see, there's a couple of tricks as well here. We've got in this deck to get this card back into your hand again, but this card is really key in making this deck work and getting a whole army of very strong allies out there onto the table. And the nice thing to remember is it doesn't care about the printed cost of the ally we reveal, it just needs to be the next ally in our deck. So whatever we come across, we're going to put into play. So very, very good card there. As I say, nice piece of artwork as well. So what are we going to try and find with our Timely Aid? Well, here's our first ally, who is the Dunedain Wanderer. Very high cost of 5 there. Again, not a card you'd probably consider out of a Secrecy deck for his stats, but he has 1 questing, 2 attack, 2 defense, and 2 hit points. He's also ranged, sentinel, and a value of Secrecy free, which is what we like to see in this deck. So we're getting him for a cost of 2 if we're in Secrecy mode. So we've got 2 possibilities here, two sort of options here of how to get him into play. The first one is through our Timely Aid. He comes to our rescue. The second way is if we don't hit him there, we can actually play him from hand if we're in Secrecy mode. So he's going to cost 2 leadership resources. Nice bit of flexibility there and 2 different ways to get him into play. He's very useful to defending. He's got 2 defense points. Also, if you can get 1 or 2 of these on the table, you can contribute sort of 2 for attack power, which you're going to need in this deck to do some damage. So very good card, and definitely one we want to get out via Secrecy or via Timely Aid. Our next friend that's going to come to our aid is probably no surprise here. We've got Gandalf. Again, a card I don't need to say too much about. We've seen this in previous videos. Most people are familiar with this card. If we can get it out via Timely Aid, then fantastic. It's going to really help us in this adventure. And we've got the flexibility of drawing 3 cards or dealing 4 damage, which is most of the time we're going to use. But just to mention here, we've got the ability to reduce our threat by 5. So if you come out with this card early in the game, you can take your threat down even further. And actually, I think on about turn 1 or 2, I've had my threat down around the 12 level, sometimes lower, depending on what other cards I can get out into play as well, as we're going to see some other tricks in this deck for reducing our threat. So there's Gandalf, and we have 3 copies of Gandalf. Again, I should have said all these cards are free copies. I'll mention there's some cards in this deck I've only put 2, because it plays better with 2 copies. I'll mention those as I go through. I'll also put the deck list as usual in the comment section, so you can have a go at building this deck and have some fun with it as well. Our next friend in a time of need is Boba. Very good card. He's unique, just worth noticing that little symbol there next to his name, which means that he is unique. We can only have 1 of him in play at a time. And he's cost of 3 usually, and he has 2 questing, which is his strong point. He's a quester. He can attack for 1, defend for 1, and he has 3 hit points. Now the quest action here is very good, and we're just looking at a little bit more detail. We can spend 1 spirit resource to put both into play from our hand, exhausted and committed to a quest. If you quest successfully this phase and both are still in play, return them to your hand. Now, very, very useful. Frodo will usually have the spirit resource to play here. You can play one resource during the quest phase early on if he's in your starting hand. You've then got an extra 2 questing power there to commit to the quest, to add to the quest value. The interesting bit here is if you quest successfully this phase and both are still in play, he goes back to your hand. What the other side of that is, which is quite nice, if you don't quest successfully, he stays in play, which is something some people miss. So if you look like you're going to fail the quest, if you can just sort of, perhaps you're willing to come under one willpower less than the quest requires, then that will count as failing. He would then stay in play. Just on that point, that if you equal the quest value, so say you need 10, there's 10 threat in the staging area, you need 10 quest power, that doesn't count as being successful or unsuccessful, so it wouldn't trigger this. You'd have to come in under to be unsuccessful, so unsuccessful would count as being, would be as under the threat level in the staging area. But very, very good card, and again one we would play perhaps several times. We can get it back to our hand if we quest successfully, and we can get out several times during the adventure. So very, very good card. And really nice piece of artwork there again. That's a really nice nice job the artist has done there. Got both of his staff looking like he's coming to our aid in a time of need through the wind and the twigs blowing past him there. And his beard's not really helping with his wind resistance, but it's probably slowing him down a little bit. Our next ally is at a cost of 4, is a spirit ally, is Elfhelm. And again, this is unique, so we're only going to have one of these in play at any time. And he's a Rohan warrior, and usually a massive cost of 4. Again, towards the end of this adventure, the sort of cycle of this deck, you might be able to play him from hand. As we've seen, there's some pretty crazy resource generation going on if we can get that engine set up early on. And I can find towards the end that I'm playing these higher cost cards from hand, just because I've got the resources there to do that. He's 1 quest, 2 attack, 2 defense, so we're going to really be using him to defend in this quest and to attack. It also has quite a handy ability. If we, after your threat is raised as a result of questing unsuccessfully, or by an encounter, or a quest card effect, we can reduce our threat by 1. I actually find this is pretty handy. The only thing to note is he has to be ready, something that's sometimes played wrong. You can't exhaust him and then use that ability. He has to be actually ready, which means not exhausted. It can be quite handy though if you've got him spare, if you've not committed him to the quest. His quest power is only 1, so it's realistic you might do that. You can then take your threat down again by, and if you've only failed, say, to cover the staging area by 1 threat, you're only missing, you're going to put your threat up by 1, that would actually cancel that out. It can be quite useful in the secrecy scenario early on when you're looking to keep your secrecy down there. Quite a handy ally there. And our next ally. So, as you probably noticed, there's a good number of allies in this deck. You need to have that with timely aid, otherwise there's no guarantee you're going to hit an ally. You want to make sure in that 5 cards you draw from timely aid, you actually do hit an ally. You want to give yourself the highest probability you can, and that means having sort of a deck that's about 70% allies, 70-75%. Obviously, because we don't want to draw events, because we don't get to keep any of those, although we do get some shuffle them back into our deck. Northern Tracker, very handy in this deck, helps us manage the staging area. I won't talk too much about this card, most people are familiar with this card, and it lets us manage the staging area locations, and we can put a progress token on all locations in the staging area. Very, very handy. Quest gives this deck a questing power, more power from a questing perspective. Also, the interesting thing I always find about Northern Tracker is it does have quite good defence. Unusually, he's got 2 defence there, and also sort of pretty massive 3 hit points, so he can take a hit or 2. He can take anything up to 5. He's going to survive through that, and he can also hit back as well for 2 as well. So he's more powerful than he looks actually in that photo. He can actually take part in some fighting. I actually have 2 copies of Northern Tracker there. I think probably 2 is probably enough. You could vary that. You could put up to 3 in there. I think there's no particular reason why I've only got 2. It's just to allow some sort of variation in the allies, and also to include some cards we're going to see in a second. Okay, we then have Eristor in the deck as well, who's an Noldor unique again. The action here is what's quite useful. He's a 4-cost leadership ally. 2 questing, so very handy to quest with. No attack, 1 defense, 3 hit points. The action here is quite useful. We can choose and discard 1 card from our hand to draw a card. Doesn't sound like much, but it's actually one of the only cards actually in the set so far that allows this sort of cycling ability of cards from your hand. And more than that, it will allow for cycling of dead cards in your hand, cards that you don't want to have in your hand that don't have any more use. So we've seen we've got a couple of unique allies here. Once you've got one of those on the table, you probably don't want to have that card in your hand anymore. Also things like the card that lets us, just going to find that card again, where we can take an initiative, where we can discard the card. Later on in the adventure, we've probably got too many allies in play to play that card. We're probably not going to benefit from it. So again, cards like that, we can cycle them. So pretty handy effect. You can only do it once per round. It's important to just notice that in the brackets. We can only do it once per round. But pretty good effect, and a good way of just getting cards in your hand. You're going to need more. Things like Timely Aid and other cards later in the adventure that are going to be more use than cards that perhaps are more used at the beginning, such as the resource generation cards. So pretty good. And next up, another ally. We have the Wandering Took, Spirit resource ally from the core set. looking very relaxed there, probably too relaxed to actually need him to get up and actually do something to help us. The reason this card's included, in multiplayer his ability is quite handy in this deck. If we give the Wandering Took to another player, we can raise that player's threat by 3, but in return we reduce our threat by 3. So obviously early on in the deck, pretty low cost ally, we can get this hopefully onto the table. If we want to keep our threat down just for a little bit longer, perhaps our resource engine isn't working yet, isn't established, we can send this guy off to one of our fellow players and we can actually reduce our threat by 3. So pretty handy there. And actually interesting, a card I hadn't actually considered playing before, so it's interesting to see how in some of these later adventure packs, some of these new mechanisms we're seeing in the game, how it actually brings some cards back again, and I quite like that, the fact that cards that you've put in your cupboard somewhere and thought you're never going to play, and perhaps considering burning, you can actually bring back into the game again and actually do have a use. And we're seeing that more and more with cards, and I think it's quite interesting in the last few adventure packs, we're sort of thinking, oh, actually that card would be quite handy. So that's 2 copies of the Wandering Took there, just to make use of his effect. I've also got Sneak Attack, just because it's always useful. I think if you're playing a leadership deck, I think it's almost a given you're probably going to want Sneak Attack in there somewhere. So a couple of copies of Sneak Attack, just in case we find Gandalf in our hand, or one of these other allies, we can get them into play, just to defend for us, just to quest for us, gives us a bit of flexibility there. And do remember it's just the phase that this character stays in play, not the entire round. So the questing phase or the combat phase, but they will go back to your hand afterwards, which is pretty good. And of course you get the effect from Gandalf if you Sneak Attack him in, so you can take your threat down again, or blast something in the staging area, or that's crept up on you and you can actually get rid of it. Another very low cost card which works well in this deck is Ancient Mathom, one of the cards from the first cycle of adventure packs here. So cost of 1 spirit resource, we attach it to a location. After we explore that location, we get 3 cards, which again is very useful. In this deck you want to just try and draw as many cards as you can. It can be helpful just to, if you start with bad hands, say you're missing your resource generation, you can hopefully quest to successfully enough to get rid of a location, and then you can draw 3 cards, and hopefully there'll be something you can use. It's a nice card there. The Mathom looks like a sort of garbage bag. It looks a little bit like it's a bit unsure what that is, a sack with some rope time around the top. It's an okay piece of artwork. It's not my favourite. It's pretty good cards that were included there. Another very good card here that I put in after a bit of testing, which I found actually helped the deck a lot, and I'll explain why. The Will of the West, which is a core set card again, and costs 1 spirit resource, a very low cost. It's choose a player, shuffle that player's discard pile back into his deck. The only reason I've included this is that cards such as Timely Aid are very, very useful in this deck and never really stop being useful. Even when towards the end of the adventure, you can still probably find the 4 resources to play them from hand. So it's a little bit of a sort of evaluation you have to make here. You need to look at your discard, decide if the cards in there are worth having back in your deck. If you've got 3 copies of Timely Aid sitting in your discard with a couple of the powerful allies, and perhaps some things like Ancient Mathom, Sneak Attack, even, I'm just looking through the cards again, some of the things like the Good Meal, which still remain quite useful. I'll just show you that card again. The Good Meal, where it reduces the cost by 2. You just need to make that decision. If you think your discard's going to be more useful in your deck, then flip it in and shuffle it in. Just one rules point, you don't shuffle in this copy of the Will of the West, so when you play this, because the card effect hasn't resolved, this card would end up in your discard pile as the only card after you've shuffled. So you don't shuffle this card in as well. Just worth clarifying that. But obviously if you've shuffled in the previous copy, if you played a copy previously, that would be shuffled in. So if you've got 3 copies, which we have here, then we're all set. We can actually just keep cycling that card. A couple of other events. We've got a Test of Will. Again, very low cost, always a very handy card. Just because of some pretty nasty when revealed effects in some of the recent packs. Thinking of things like the Long Dark. We've also got things like Sleeping Sentry, although I'm just wondering if you can actually cancel Sleeping Sentry. But there's certainly some pretty nasty when revealed effects, and it's always helpful to have that flexibility to just cancel those. And for 1 resource, I usually find I can get that out of hand pretty easily. Card we saw a little bit earlier, which is pretty good, Out of Sight. The card I wasn't convinced of at first. I couldn't really see that it would be that useful, but I actually do find myself playing it quite a bit. Early on in the adventure, you can find yourself just needing a bit of time to get your resource engine up and running. You just want to get your Steward of Gondor out, you want to get your resourceful out, so you can get in those extra resources. This can actually, bizarrely, just buy you a bit of time. It only costs 2 to play. I have actually played this a few times. It just stops your enemies attacking you this phase. And with this deck, if you give it a go yourself, you'll see that it's quite sensitive, that just 1 or 2 turns of growth can actually make a massive difference to how you sort of fare in the quest. So a pretty good card, actually one I've managed to bring out quite a few times. So I've got 3 copies of that in a minute. As I say, as I go through this and we get new cards in the next adventure packs, I might well sort of update this video and swap out some of the cards and share that with you guys as well. So also got in here the Galadrim's Greeting, cost of 3. In a threat reduction deck, it works pretty well. It can bring your threat down. Sometimes it can go from, say, 23 threat back under the secrecy threshold again, which is pretty cool. The cost is higher than I'd like. I mean, it's not. I wouldn't be surprised eventually if we see a card that costs slightly less to reduce the threat. We've got things. I can't remember the exact name of the card, but there is one in the. I think it's either Return to Rivendell, which costs 0, and we can actually reduce our threat by 3. I haven't got this in this deck. Maybe I should have that in this deck. Further testing, I might swap it out. I think that one you might need a unique Sylvan or Noldor, which might be the problem. I think neither Frodo or Gloin qualify. But obviously with Glorfindel coming out, who's this new massive ally for 5 threat, the new version, that might change things up a little bit. Although I do like Frodo's ability to be able to defend. That is quite handy, especially if you're about to be clobbered by a cave troll. You can actually come out of that still alive. And with your threat down around the 20s, and you're not, if you've gone past the point where you care about secrecy limits, then that's actually no longer a really particular threat. You can just absorb that. And to finish off, just a last event here, we've got Ever Vigilant. Just to really get the full value out of our heroes and our allies, we can actually ready an ally card, just a nice cheap effect there. More useful than perhaps it would appear. Sometimes you want a quest and then you start the game, you've perhaps got 2 or 3 allies on the table. You can actually ready one of those and use it for attacking and defending, in addition to questing. So that's the deck. Thanks for watching. I hope you give the deck a go and have some fun with it. As I say, it's probably one of my favourite decks to play just because it's slightly different, because there's a sort of excitement there of just having the 2 heroes and getting that resource engine up and running. As I say, it works. I'm about 80% happy with it. When it works really well. Over the next few months, I'll try and improve the deck and add a few things into it. And post in the comment section, and please subscribe, and I'll make another video soon. Thank you.